Hey there, welcome to First Look. Thanks for being here this week. As we're moving through, well, by the time you see, well, no, when you see this, it'll still be August, but we're moving into a new month of September as of this Sunday, and I think this month is going to be an interesting one because we could see some different changes over the course of the next 30 days or so. Those of us at Northmont had um, 4 people join our church on Sunday, which is great. We have a baptism on September 25th. We are looking for a new children and youth director. And we're looking into some things with our former child care center wing. And all of that comes with a lot of changes. And it comes with just, a mindfulness about the fact that we're never really at a standstill. Everything's always kind of moving. And if it's not, then that's when we know that we're in trouble. Today's first look is brought to you by Sheets Coffee. I don't know if I never try to recommend coffee that comes from, that's not like something you do at home. But, sometimes you just gotta, you gotta take it where you can. So that's my day today. So anyway, today's brought to you by Sheets Coffee. So this week, as we're thinking about all that change and all of that kind of stuff, we're looking at this passage this time about kind of moving through Luke chapter 14, and we're getting near the end of the chapter there, and we have to remember where we've been so that we can get a sense of what's happening in this passage. So this one is probably a passage that you know, but it's not a famous parable. It's not like maybe top 5 parables, but it's one of those things that talks about the cost of things. So the subtitle I have in mind is The Cost of Discipleship, but you could really talk about it as priorities. That's really kind of what it's getting at. And I am doing a true first look with this, but of course, just scanning it, I've obviously read the passage before and so have some little idea of what it is. But I think the reason that I mentioned in the get-go all the little changes, the new month and new staff and new things we're looking at, part of the reason is that this is another good example for me of something where Jesus introduces an idea that is not the idea of devoting oneself to God is not a new one. But I think it's the lens through which he decides to talk about that, which is interesting because he starts talking about how we separate ourselves from our family. He uses that analogy, which I think is a really interesting one when you think about just who he's talking to. And I'll explain that in a second. Let me get another sip of my Sheets coffee. All right. So anyway, we're in Luke chapter 14. We're talking about verses 25 through 33. So just as a reminder, we talked about hospitality this past week, which makes sense because we were inviting new members. And then the lectionary passes by this parable of the great dinner because it has some similar themes to it from the shorter parable that we just talked about in our last passage. So it's about someone who is making a dinner and people are supposed to show up and they don't show up, and so the person who's having the party says, "Go out into the roads and lanes and compel the people to come in so that my house may be filled." You know that parable, but it's another one of hospitality, and it's also another one of putting down the expectations of the world, putting down the kind of acceptable behavior that we all are accustomed to, and seek to do something else, seek to do something more. And it kind of tears at the norms and foundations of the world as it was, or maybe as it is. Because in the parable we did for this past Sunday, and in the one that we're skipping, that's verses 15 through 24, you're talking about what you would normally expect to do. What would be good and proper to do. And you're inviting people, you're going to a party, you're accepting an invitation, you're doing that as sort of a quid pro quo in society, with the expectation that people will respond, with the expectation that people will, maybe at some point invite you. And what you see in those two parables kind of tears at the way that we assume things work. So Jesus is telling the people in the audience, we do things in life because we think we're going to get something back. But the kingdom that I am trying to build here, that I'm going to be building through you, has to start from a different foundation. And that foundation has to be built on a kind of radical hospitality. One that doesn't involve getting anything back. One that doesn't expect that the people that you're inviting can offer you something in return. And that changes the way you see the world, when everything isn't built on this sort of the economics of, I do this and so everybody else does this because I'll get something eventually. It's built on what does it mean to be hospitable, knowing that no one might be hospitable to you back. And what does that mean for the way we understand the world and understand our time and understand our resources? That's building something else. So as we move into this passage, Jesus is also tearing a little bit at those foundational things that you and I think of as core values. Here's what I mean. In verse 25, he's talking to large crowds, and he says the following. Large crowds were traveling with him, and he turned and said to them, whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brother and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation, is it not able to finish? All who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, this fellow began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king, going out to wage war against another king, will not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot, then while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for the terms of peace. So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all of your possessions. End of scene. There's a brilliance to that you think, well, it's Jesus, Ben. Like, it's not. You're not brilliant for thinking that Jesus said something brilliant. That's true. What I love about that is the layers of kind of oxymoron that you see there, opposites that are layered on top of each other. Because what could be more foundational, especially if you are a Jewish person at the time, a Torah following, devout person? How could adhering to the belief of family not be the most fundamental and paramount to the way that you live your life? Everything that we know, everything that we've ever read about anything in our Old Testament or in Hebrew scriptures tells us that family, tribal, nation identity is beyond anything. That there's a connection to who you are, who you're a part of, and the land, right? We know that those identifying markers that really ground us are a huge part of that identity. That the people being, one nation of Israel, what was broken after David and Solomon, the fact that they split into two, that was a huge breaking point. That the fact that they were not faithful to each other or to the stranger or to the land meant exile. How big of a deal it was that they returned back to the land. The identification of lineage. I mean, even going back to Jesus. In two Gospels, what we have is this lineage of Jesus that connects him to David, which solidifies and justifies his position as Messiah. Family and your connection to family is a huge deal. Not only in a religious faith identity kind of way, but also just in a legal, practical way. We talk a lot about inheritance. At least Jesus talks a lot about inheritance. Well, inheritance only happens because of whose family we're in. Jesus saying this, just this one line, is not only, I'm sure, very hard to hear. I need to hate my family or whatever, but tears at the fabric of just social, family, practical thinking. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Not having those family connections leaves you in a place of complete and utter vulnerability. Wouldn't make any sense to anyone at all. Which is interesting when you take that idea, which we'll break down a little bit more in a second, and then you put it up against this sort of practical example that Jesus gives. Right? He says, what person doesn't make a plan when they build? What person doesn't make a plan before going to war? What person doesn't know what they're doing before they, build a tower? All of those things were like, well, yeah, those are all very practical ways of thinking about the world, and yet they are put up against, they're supposed to complement this idea, this very impractical idea of not worrying about whose line you're from. Look at those for a minute, and hopefully you'll see what I'm saying. Jesus gives the least practical kind of advice or guidance that you could possibly give, and then justifies it through very practical examples. Now, that can be confusing on one hand, but on the other hand, the genius of it is this, that Jesus is tearing at those foundational assumptions that we make. And he's doing so by pointing out very practical things, and thus highlighting our dependency on that way of thinking. Jesus knows that people are dependent on thoughtfulness, connections, practicality. There's a practicality to the Torah, there's a practicality to Jesus' teachings, or at least, all of the teachings that we know of up until Jesus' time. Because when you look at the law, when you look at the laws that were given to the people, most of those laws are very practical in nature once you weed through them. They're all about things that keep you either physically healthy, eat this but don't eat this, eat that but don't eat that, or they're about ways that will keep the um, the body, the people together. Things that will keep them together, reliant on each other. You're in, you're out. You're in, you're out. Right? It's putting a very clear hedge the on that community. Right? It's making sure that people stay bonded and connected and together. Uh, or they're about procreation. Right? What will grow this nation? Right? So all the whole law. Now, I'm certainly not an expert on the law, but my take on it is that there's a very practical nature to it. Things that will keep you healthy, together, and growing. And so Jesus uses that mindset to then say something radical. He uses concepts that people would understand: thoughtfulness, planning, thinking something through, knowing what you have, taking account and being responsible for what you've been giving, a kind of stewardship of the land and your resources, right? All very thoughtful, practical things. Things your parents would probably wish that you were better at, or you wish your kids were better at. Things that you teach your kids. Hey, if you're going to do this, make sure you know that you have everything you need. But he uses those examples to then compel them to do something radical. If you're going to be my disciple, then you have to hate your family and bear the cross. Something that has virtually no practicality to it. So he's taking the way that they think currently, the way that they think now, and applying it to a way that they would never think, as kind of a bridge to a new reality. I hope that makes some sense. I hope that my point makes sense. Jesus is doing something, is taking something that they already do and allowing them to be the foundation for how they get ready to do something that they don't know how to do at all. Right? Which is how you do almost anything. If I tell you to go bungee jumping, everything, if you told me to go bungee jumping, then everything about that is not practical to me. I don't want to do that. It scares me to death and I don't want to. But if you told me the way to think about bungee jumping is this, right? Someone out there has probably done it, or someone who has. And they would probably tell you, well, all you really have to do is take little steps and know this. And here's the feeling. They would relate something that you could get your head around to an experience that you can't get your head around, right? That's how you would prepare someone to do something that feels insane, that feels intense. You would give them some practical things that they could think through that would allow them to get ready for the impossible, which is what you would have to do for me to get me to go bungee jumping. Because one of two things would have to happen. Either my family would have to be, like in mortal danger, or you would have to give me some very, very good, solid arguments as to why that was a good choice, which would be almost impossible to do. But that's the way you do it. And I think that's the way I interpret Jesus doing it here. He wants them to do something radical, and he does so by giving them a practical way of getting there. Also, I don't think that Jesus is literally trying to get these people to hate their families. What he's actually doing is using this kind of hyperbolic language to get them into a mindset that, look, part of following me will be doing the opposite of what you have always done. You have always done something that feels like um, reasonable and manageable and together. But the foundation that I'm laying, and this is really, I think, the point of the passage, I am laying a new foundation for the kingdom of God. It's not going to be built on the same thing. It's the reason why he gets upset with his disciples whenever they ask, you know, who's going to be highest, who's going to be on your left, who's going to be on your right, and who's going to be important. It's the reason that he gets mad about that whenever they ask him. And it's the same reason that he says, look, when you invite someone, don't invite the people who, who can, do something for you. Invite the poor and invite those who don't have anything, who, have been, aren't a part of society. It's the reason why Jesus does so many things that no one does. Why he talks to the woman at the well, why he talks about Samaritans the way he does, why he goes out into other regions and heals people from other places. It's because, and you've heard me say this now 100 times, the kingdom of God is going to be built on something else. And he's trying to prepare people for that idea. And so he's telling people something that will be really hard for them to hear. Everything you've built, everything you think you know, when it comes to following me, all of that is going to be left behind. So everything that you rely on, literally, physically, emotionally, I'm asking you to pivot. I'm asking you to do something else. I'm asking you not to be so consumed by what you've always been consumed by, to always rely on what you've always relied on. And that's a pretty big ask. And so he gets them ready by saying, you know how when you build something, you know where you're going, you know if you have everything you need, you get those resources prepared for what you're about to build. That's what I'm doing with you. That's what we're doing here. I'm preparing you. I'm making sure that you're prepared for what's about to happen, because it's going to change the world, or at least it should. And what reminds me of that is the fact that the way the church started, right? The disciples created a church where everyone had everything in common, right? They were supposed to sell everything they had and come together and live very differently than the way that they were living. Now that broke down pretty quickly. But that was the plan. That was where they started. And I think that Jesus was trying to prepare them for that reality, or at least that way of thinking, even if they didn't do it literally, in forever and ever. That was the goal. And so much of the way that I understand who Jesus is that he takes the things that usually make us very comfortable and force us to think about either living uncomfortably or finding something new to be comfortable in. When he asked his disciples to go to Samaria or to talk to this person or to heal this person, that probably made them pretty uncomfortable at first. And then hopefully I think that they found a new way of being over time that gave them the sense that, look, we're not going to just keep doing the same thing we've always done, but just do it better and nicer. We have to wipe it all clean and start fresh, because otherwise it's just the same old. And that's the way I understand this passage. Jesus getting people ready for that idea. And the practical part about that is how you and I tend to approach our life like, well, as long as I'm going to get a job and accept the world the way it is, and I'll do the norm, and I won't expect anything radical to ever change, or that I could be a part of anything that radically changes the way that we see the world, because, I've kind of found a way to live in it. And yeah, I know it's broken in places, and I know that other people, you know, don't always have what they need, but like if I found a way to live here and to do this life and to, you know, uh, make it work for me, then everybody else should too. I don't really, if they haven't found a way to make their lives work, then that's on them. I don't have to worry about the system. I don't have to worry about the, you know, the world and its state. I made it work. You should be able to make it work, and that's my reasoning behind keeping things the way that they are. And I think Jesus compels us to something else. So those are my thoughts. That's the way I'm kind of approaching this. So we'll see where it goes, and maybe I'll talk about that on Sunday, and maybe this is your alternative perspective on what I end up saying. I don't know. We'll see if the Sheets coffee kicks in, and maybe I'll think of something else. Anyway, by the way, whenever you're reading this, make sure that you read the Philemon passage. So the other passage that goes along with this is Philemon. It's only one chapter. I plucked out of there verses 10 through 19, but you could really just read the whole thing. It's only this big of a book. So I know that I'll be looking at pairing what we see in Philemon versus what we see in this passage. The two will be connected in some way. So if you want to read that too, go ahead. Okay. That's what I have for you this week. Thanks for thinking all that through with me. If you are sharing this with someone, or if you're encouraging someone to interact with and participate in this study, remind them that they don't have to look at my silly face the whole time. That if they want to just listen to it while they're going grocery shopping, that's more than acceptable. Because I think sometimes you feel like, do I have to really look at him talk at me on the screen for 27 minutes? No, you can just listen as you move on, do something else. Anyway, just throwing that out there. You can think of me as a really short, poorly produced podcast. All right, thank you for being you. I hope you have a wonderful week. Labor Day weekend is just around the corner, so we're looking forward to seeing you in a new month, and a new time, and all the things that we're doing here at Northmont. So be blessed, and I'll talk to you next time.